understanding what the scriptures and what the Christian tradition means and how it understands demons and demonic possession is really important to understanding what Jesus' mission is and how he saves us. If you look through the ministry of Jesus, you can sort of break down sort of some categories of what he's doing, right, during his 3 years of ministry. And one of them is he's healing people, right? Another one, he's casting out demons, right? And he's teaching people, right? There are some other stuff where, he's doing some other miracles also, like walking on the water, right? Or raising the dead. And one of the things that this sort of, you could call those maybe sort of like the nature miracles, right? And those demonstrate that there's this power that he has over nature itself. But what's important about that is that the nature miracles, they function to serve to demonstrate his divinity, right? That he's more than just a mere man, so they give some insight into the person of Jesus, which is always how you get insights into people, by what they do, right? And what the nature miracles show us is this, they show a harmony with nature, that things are sort of put into right place. You see this in some of the saints, where like animals become their friends and things like this, right? I had a friend who went to was at Mount Athos, and there was like a monk who was talking to them, and as he was talking, like a bunch of birds just came and landed all over him, so you get this phenomenon with people with sanctity, where the fear of animals, of people, disappears, even of wild animals. This is a pattern that shows up in a lot of saint stories, right? And what it demonstrates is a harmony back with nature. So it sort of harkens back to sort of the Garden of Eden, where things are all sort of put in right relationship, and the human person, man, is now back in his proper place, which is he is sort of the master and dominion over all of nature, right? Not as a tyrant, right? But as someone who cares for it in a certain way. So you have that. You've got the healing of diseases, right? But the healing diseases and the casting out of demons are kind of they overlap, right? Sometimes it's does this person just have does the boy who throws himself into the fire, this is one of the things he heals them of, is it just epilepsy, or is it something demonic, right? And sometimes the boundary line there isn't very clear, right? And what you get with both demonic possession and with healing is this ministry of Jesus delivering human people, right, human persons from bondage, from slavery, right? And taking them from a place where they're not in control, they don't have freedom, right, to a place where they are free and they have agency and they can act in the world. And what these three kind of describe is sort of this condition of the human person being restored, which is the human condition, the fallen and broken state, is one where we're not in right relationship with sort of our environment, with the nature, with other people, right? There's something sort of disjointed about all of it. And the other one is that we are in bondage and slavery, and we're not free. And so there's this element of liberation that occurs, which is why it's significant that in the Gospels the Passion Week occurs leading up to the Feast of Passover, right? Because the Feast of Passover in the narrative of Exodus is entirely about what? Right? Deliverance, liberation, freedom from oppression or tyranny, and so sin and devil. And so one of the things that happens that Jesus does is when he says things like love your enemies, right? One of the commands here is trying to enlighten us to understand that who is our real enemy. And so you can see who the real enemy is, and it's not my neighbor, right? It's not even the person who's the other sinner next to me, right? It's not that. It's not even the evil person who's doing harm to you, right? It is something deeper. It's that we're all victims, right? Even those who are victimizing other people are also still victims, right, of this oppressive spirit, right? And so let's talk about spirits now, because this is helpful to understand the very nature of the kind of bondage that Jesus is trying to deliver us from. When you look at spirits, in the tradition, the church takes a couple different directions. Sometimes you get demons are understood sort of as they sort of stand in for some sort of mental illness of some kind, right, of some way. And this makes sense when I give you the definition of spirit. So I'll hold off on it, okay, what spirits are. It's sort of like the person who is mentally ill is not in their right mind, right? They're the them is somehow hidden or obscured under layers of something else, right? So they're not the real person. We see this sort of, I think, with addiction can do this, right? Where it's like the substance took over, and it's now like I'm talking to the heroin, I'm talking to the alcohol. I'm not talking to them. What does that sound like? Possession. Demon possession, right? Exactly. So whether or not it's like ontologically like, an entity or not, like the phenomenon, the experience of it is for all intents and purposes demonic, right? And so that's important of what's going on there in that case with like a demon. The other way that the church sort of talks about demons is sometimes it psychologizes it, right? Like a good figure would be John Cassian, if you want to go read one of the church fathers, right? And so it's like demons are sort of like, we capture with the phrase we use today, my inner demons, right? So demons are definitely like that, like, and so usually the demons are sort of associated with passions, right? And the passions, instead of using sin, the church will often use passions because the word passion itself means suffering, right? Like the passion of the Christ. This is why we say, like, I'm passionate about something. We say, I love it so much I'm willing to suffer for it. That's why we use passion in that sense for, like, things we're enthusiastic about that we really care about. And so passions are sins that sort of take on a life of their own, right? And sort of like control us, right? And drive us to things where we feel out of control, right? Like that's a passion, right? We can remind ourselves of the phrase from Paul where he says, the things I know I should do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do, I do. Who will deliver me from this bondage, right? This phrase is talking about. This very aptly describes sort of like, a human experience, right? Of what it means to sort of like live in this life in a human body. Is one where we're conflicted internally, right? We're like divided, and there's different forces and powers at play, and so there's an inner conflict, right? And so this is why one of the ways to describe what Jesus is doing on the cross and in the resurrection is this phrase Christus Victor, which means Christ conquers, right? And it's this idea is that there's some sort of enemy, and Christ is coming to destroy that enemy. He's destroying the enemy of sickness. He's destroying the enemy of demon possession, right? He's destroying this enemy of sin and passions, right? To free us from this, because one way to understand the human experience is one of deep conflict, right? And conflict is this like lack of harmony, right? And so it ties right back into the idea of like these nature miracles, where things are in harmony. When you have the like the leopard or say like the bear with Saint Seraph coming. Like the bear, usually there's some sort of enmity or fear that exists between sort of like a bear and a human person, and that's why there would usually be conflict between the two if you ran into each other, especially if you got between like the cubs and like a mother bear or something like this, right? And you're like, well, your life's in danger now. But there, with Seraph, this like wild bear who became just like his pet, there's a lack of conflict, right? There's harmony. So things are sort of put back into the right place. And so we live in a sort of experience of conflict with each other, with nature, and within ourselves. And so this sort of conflict is sort of like, how do we become victorious? This is why on the bread that we offer for communion, right, the bread is stamped, right? And on it is like this, right? This right here, the Jesus Christos Nika, right? That Jesus Christ conquers. Jesus Christ is the victor. So it's like there's something about even the celebration of the liturgy, which is like a victory celebration after a war has been won, right? Like that's also sort of like the war has been won after the battle, right? Like a bunch of Vikings or something. We sit down for a feast and we sort of like have a great time because we won, right? That's what that table is. It's the victory table. It's the feast of victory, right? Over these forces. And so spirits can be understood sort of in this psychological way. There also can be understood demons as something sort of like, we would say sort of like an actual entity of some kind that has some degree of like almost personality to it in some way. But it's definitely not like a person. There's something like sub-person about like demons in that sense. They're not like people like we are. They're like these fractures or pieces of personality that are sort of just like almost like forces, right? And so what's scary about that is sometimes the fullness of our personhood degrades to such a degree that we're more like a demon, like a sub-person, than we are actually like a real full human being, right? And so that's what's sort of like scary about those. And when Christians, we're sort of like conquering the pagan world, their responses to sort of like the god, like other temples and other gods, was sometimes they would say these things are just mere figments of people's imaginations, and sometimes they would say, no, these are like demons, right? And so the church kind of said both of these things as it was sort of like conquering everything. And one of the reasons that's been given before explanation of why did the monks go out into the wilderness is because that was the last place to fight demons. Right? Because the demons have been driven out of all the temples, driven out of all the cities, and the only place was to go into the wilderness where the demons were. There's something about the wilderness, right, as a symbol that captures sort of where the engagement with the demonic happens, right? Where is Jesus tempted, right? At the beginning of his ministry, like in the wilderness, right? Where do the Hebrew people, after they cross the Red Sea and they're into they're not in the Promised Land yet, they're wandering in the wilderness, right? That's where the temptation comes, right? Where they want to go back to Egypt, right? That's where they like complain, and then God gives them like, quail and manna, right? In the wilderness. Like, this is where the temptation happens. Anthony the Great goes out in the wilderness, and it's there that he has these conflicts and fights with the demons, right? In his monastic cell. So the wilderness, in some ways, the wilderness describes the present age. And so we live in this present age of wilderness, desiring to go back to something that's more like a garden, right? Where we came from. And so the wilderness is sort of like wild, whereas the Garden of Eden represents this sort of harmony where everything's come into sort of right relationship and sort of locked into place in some way. That's beautiful. And so we look across all these sort of, different understandings of demons to realize that it's actually a fairly complex and kind of intricate sort of understanding of what the demonic is. And so when we think of what is a spirit, right? And I'm going to offer what I think is the best definition for this. It's a thing that animates and drives you forward, right? It's an animating force, right? And so we use spirit in this way. We'll say like team spirit. What does team spirit do, right? It's like everybody is sort of like has a common purpose. And so one of the things about a spirit is that a spirit is sort of is animating you towards some sort of purpose or end. So what was the spirit? The many spirits, right? It's important that it was like many, because it's like this cacophony of spirits sort of possessing this man who's living naked in the tombs, right? Is that it's sort of this chaos, right, inside of him. And that represents sort of like, no matter what sort of like degree or version of the demonic that you want to talk about, they all capture this idea of sort of this cacophony of divided purposes, right? And drives inside of it, instead of some sort of unity where everything comes into sort of agreement. And so a spirit, like whether it's team spirit or like a mob has a spirit, like it just possesses everyone and takes you over. And so the real challenge for us is that the human person has to be possessed by something, right? You're always possessed by something. You have to have some spirit, right? So what is your spirit? It's like, is it the Holy Spirit, right? This is the spirit that properly aligns you to God, the spirit that properly leads to life and flourishing, a spirit that actually puts you in harmony. And so what we have here is the Spirit of God brings things into unity, right? Into the unity of love, right? And common purpose. Whereas the demonic spirits lead to death, division, and conflict. And so this is how we understand a spirit in this sense, and what we actually have the Holy Spirit. At the very beginning, when God creates man, right, he breathes his breath or his spirit into them. The word in Hebrew, ruach, just means like wind, breath, and spirit. It's all the same word for all those three things, right? So he breathes this life force into them, right? And you think of life, well, life is like, what is life? Well, it's all living organisms have purpose, right? I mean, they're driving towards something. And so when we think about our own lives of what we're doing, it's like, what the practical question now we can bring this home to is, what spirits possess and drive me? Right? And see the world in a spiritual sense, which means to see the spirit forces in the world driving people, possessing people, moving things forward. We can talk things like the spirit of capitalism, right? Or the spirit of America, right? And we can talk about these things because there's something real to them, right? You know, I mean, if you've ever been to a great sporting event, or ever been to like a concert where this spirit sort of unites people in some way, it's real, right? So we have this demoniac, he encounters Jesus, and Jesus liberates him from all these things and puts him back into his right mind. He frees him to actually be himself. And so, what does Jesus give us? What are we saved 4, we're saved so that we can be exactly the person who we're always meant to be. That we're saved so we can be fully human and fully ourselves. Right? So we can be free, right? Free from other forces that would drive us towards destruction, right? So that we can be free to actually live, right, and be inspired by the Spirit of God, which leads us to life and flourishing in some way. I love this vision because he casts out the demons, right, and sends them into the swine, and the swine run down the herd, and you realize that, in some sense, why swine? What does swine represent? Well, it represents something unclean, so it's in many ways, it's sort of like that. They went into the swine because that's exactly what they were trying to turn this man into, was just an animal, right? Something subhuman. And you can see what the ultimate end of the legion, right, this demon was. What did it do to the swine? It drove them over the edge and it destroyed them all, right? It's a spirit of destruction, right? And so, what are we doing here, right, in the liturgy, celebrating at this table, is we're celebrating life, right? People being able to live full and free and be truly themselves who they were meant to be, right? That kind of victory is worth celebrating, right? That's the good news, right? The good news is that Jesus, even in this day and time, even right now, can liberate and free us from all the different spirits and forces that are raging inside of us, dividing us, right? Leading us astray, and leading to all the destructive sort of patterns of behavior and choices that we make, right? That are getting in the way of us being fully ourselves. And that is worth celebrating. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever.